Hello people. Please subscribe to my small channel for support me to upload more interesting video every week. Thank you. The history of Samsung Group is closely connected with the history of the Korean Peninsula. The main milestones in the development of the main Asian conglomerate can be traced through the chronology of the Japanese-Chinese Wars and World War II, political reshuffles and coups d'état that made the 38th parallel the border between North and South Korea. Samsung was once, in many ways, the economic mainstay of the country. The holding company now accounts for 20% of South Korea's GDP, but the number of lawsuits against members of the Lee family increases every year. Accusations of corruption and fraud are poured on the holding company. While Samsung is presenting the next Galaxy update to a breathless world market, the Korean authorities are tightening the belts of the unraveled chaebol more and more. How a small fish shop in a provincial town grew into Asia's largest technological empire. The first Samsung company exported fish to China. Lee Byung-chul was born on February 12, 1910, in the village of Uran in the large Korean province of Gyeongsang Namdo. The future founder of Samsung was the youngest of 4 children in the family, the only son, and belonged to an ancient and influential family. His father Lee Jang-woo and mother An Dong-kwan were among the richest landowners in the county. At the age of 6, young Byung-chul studied classical literature at a local school established by his grandfather, Lee Hong-suk, and at the age of 12, he was transferred to a modern school, Jisu Primary School in Jinju, at that time, the provincial capital. A few years later, after leaving home, he began to attend the capital's Yungdong High School in Seoul and then, in 1929, Waseda University College in Japan. It is worth noting that Lee Byung-chul was born at the very beginning of Japanese colonization of Korea. He spent his childhood in a tumultuous and volatile era when the country was experiencing constant social upheaval and fundamental changes. Historians have described the period of Japanese rule on the Korean peninsula as a time of economic breakthroughs and the fight against illiteracy, but even by the end of colonization, in 1945, only about 20% of Koreans had completed primary education. They could read and write. Therefore, Lee Byung-chul was by no means typical of his time. Although he left the university after attending a 2-year lecture course at Waseda, Mr. Lee was considered to be a very educated young man at the age of 22. After his father's death, he returned to Korea and took over the family business. Samsung was born as an enterprise far from advanced technology, and the first steps of Lee Byung-chul in business can by no means be called successful. In 1936, the young entrepreneur invested all the capital he inherited from his father into a rice mill in the port city of Masan, but quickly went bankrupt. After the outbreak of the Japanese-Chinese War in 1937, the financial situation of many enterprises in captive Korea deteriorated sharply. 2 years later, in 1938, Mr. Lee decided to make a second attempt by opening a trading company in the large city of Daegu, Samsung Sangho. The small company exported dried fish, fruits, and vegetables to Manchuria and Beijing, which, given Korea's dependence, was not an easy task. Lee Byung-chul was not just lucky. The success of his ventures was largely due to his sound name, which opened doors to many offices even during the Japanese occupation. According to legend, the name Samsung, which in one variation of the Korean language means 3 stars, was given to his business by Lee Byung-chul in honor of his 3 sons. Although the version is questionable given the fact that the third heir, Lee Kuan-hee, was not born until January 1942. Korea gets rid of the colonizer, and Lee Byung-chul goes to the starting line. Not without losses. Within 6 years, Lee Byung-chul's trading company developed steadily, with a real boom in growth in 1945. When Korea became independent from the Japanese Empire, after its surrender in World War II in autumn 1945, the entrepreneur moved the company's headquarters to Seoul, registering the Samsung Trading Company. At that time, the firm was the largest of Korea's 10 trading companies, also engaged in small-scale food production. In 1950, the Korean War begins, an armed conflict between the new states founded in 1945, North Korea, DPRK, and South Korea, Republic of Korea, and their allied forces, mainly the USSR and the USA. The large-scale military clash forces Lee Byung-chul to flee Seoul and urgently remove his production facilities from the capital. In early 1951, the businessman opens evacuated warehouses and production facilities in the port city of Busan, which is occupied by US troops at the time. Allied patronage in the south of the Korean peninsula provided Lee Byung-chul's company with stability. After the US troops landed, the businessman began to actively sell his goods to them. Samsung gradually expands. In 1953 a textile factory, new food production facilities, and later a large sugar factory are launched. Lee takes over more and more areas, seeing in the crisis a sea of new opportunities. It is worth noting that despite American patronage and close ties with South Korea's first president, Lee Sung-man, Samsung warehouses and production facilities were repeatedly set on fire and liquidated during the Korean War. More than once Lee Byung-chul had to start everything from scratch. After the end of military operations, in 1953, Lee Sung-man made the head of Samsung one of the country's top businessmen. The merchant was able to rebuild all his production facilities and return to Seoul as he regularly began to receive major government contracts in key areas of the national economy. Since 1958, Samsung began to expand into other industries: banking, media, chemicals and shipbuilding. Lee Byung-chul and his companies maintained their dominant position until the coup d'état, April Revolution, in South Korea in 1960, during which Lee Sung-man was overthrown and fled the country. The Korean economic miracle. The persecution of the associates of the first president began throughout South Korea. Lee Byung-chul was accused of having corrupt ties with the former leadership of the country. To avoid imprisonment, he had to leave South Korea for a time. The end of 1960 and the beginning of 1961 was a troubled time for the whole country. Public and political protests continued, and chaos reigned at the top of power. On May 16, 1961, as a result of a military coup, the leader of the uprising, Park Chung-hee, nominally the third president of South Korea, came to power. In Europe, Park Chung-hee is known as the ideologue of the Korean economic miracle, which finally got the country's economy back on its feet and overtook its main competitor, North Korea, in terms of growth rate. For Koreans themselves, the third president became the face of political repression and terror. From his first days in power, Mr. Park set out to create a powerful export-oriented industrial economy, requiring him to mobilize all of the country's productive forces. Therefore, he makes an offer to disgraced businessman Lee Byung-chul. Charges against the businessman will be dropped on the condition that Samsung gives up control over the acquired banks and follows the economic directives of the new government. Lee Byung-chul accepts the offer and returns to South Korea. Park Chung-hee's plan consisted of creating large private conglomerates and strictly dividing them into the most promising industrial sectors. The country urgently needed to increase exports, so government credit lines were opened for the largest and most promising companies on favorable terms, and large government orders were given to them. This led to the birth of the clan economy, an economy that stands on the chaebol, the family conglomerates that South Korea still relies on. In addition to Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, and Goldstar, about 25 companies in all, received similar preferences in the 1960s and 1970s. By the way, Lee Byung-chul headed the chaebol-based Federation of Korean Industries, created by Park Chung-hee. Samsung Group had to align its activities with the new economic model. The most promising market segments for Lee Byung-chul are electronics, shipbuilding, and media. So in 1969, Mr. Lee founded Samsung Electric Industries in Suwon, a large industrial center, and a year later he invested part of his fortune in two mass media, TBC Radio and the Jongnam Ilbo newspaper. In the next 20 years, Samsung will create and get rid of, in the crisis waves, dozens of subsidiaries. The conglomerate's assets now include entire holdings related to construction, household appliances, chemical production, shipbuilding, and the entertainment industry, although the brand's true global fame will be brought by electronics. The birth of the legendary Samsung. Immediately after its founding, Samsung Electric Industries faced technological problems. Korea simply did not have its own technology to create complex devices. But Japan could boast of successful developments, so in the same 1969, Lee Byung-chul signed an agreement with the Japanese company Sanyo Electronics. For another 10 years, the Korean giant will produce equipment partially under another brand, borrowing technology and even buying finished parts from more advanced colleagues. Such partnership deprived Samsung of the lion's share of profits, but it was the only possible development option. Only by 1975, Lee Byung-chul was able to get rid of foreign help by registering a new brand Samsung Electronics. Gradually the company begins to produce black and white TV sets with relatively good image quality. The equipment is actively exported abroad. The first Samsung Electronics TV set was released in 1972, and by 1981 it had already sold about 10 million units. In 1983, one of Samsung's subsidiaries produced the first Korean DRAM chip. The technology was highly praised by experts and the market. Over time, the development began to be purchased by manufacturers around the world for use in their devices. In the same 1983 year, Lee Byung-chul made a sensational announcement: Samsung was opening semiconductor production, entering a new market. This step is still called the biggest game in Lee Byung-chul's life. The businessman was not mistaken. Today Samsung is the world's largest manufacturer of microchips and memory cards, and the direction with a turnover of $17 billion has become the main source of profit for the holding company. Against the backdrop of Samsung's incredible success, the news of Lee Byung-chul's illness broke. He was diagnosed with cancer. The businessman began to undergo treatment, but it was too late. The founder of Samsung died in 1987 at the age of 77. At the time of his death, the combined staff of Lee Byung-chul's business projects numbered 70,000 employees, the turnover was in the millions of dollars, and the conglomerate was divided into 4 independent groups for 4 heirs: Samsung, Shinsky, CJ Group and Hansol. 2 weeks after his father's death, on December 1, 1987, Lee Byung-chul's third son, Lee Kuan-hee, became chairman of the Samsung Group. The incredible Lee Kuan-hee. Despite Lee Byung-chul's impressive successes, it is Lee Kuan-hee who is credited with creating Samsung's current image as the world's most successful technology company. By the time he inherited the company, he was 45 years old, had an MBA from George Washington University, and more than a decade in the management structures of his father's companies. In the late 80s, Samsung was one of the most successful companies in South Korea, but it was still a dark horse in the world market. Samsung Electronics specialized mostly in the production of budget equipment and could not compete in any way with such giants as Sony or Nokia. In addition, the conglomerate was significantly affected by the economic crisis of the 1980s. The successor set the goal of reversing the status quo and putting the company on the global top, but the plans were somewhat hindered by the economic situation in Korea. Even with the launch of its first cell phone in 1988 and its world leadership in the chip manufacturing segment, Samsung has been making losses since 1990. The need for change was long overdue. The beginning of the restructuring was the Samsung Frankfurt Declaration. On July 7, 1993, Lee Kuan-hee gathered all the top managers of Samsung in Frankfurt and for 3 days introduced them to the new brand concept. Lee Kuan-hee completely reformatted the company's management system, got rid of some unprofitable subsidiaries, established export relations, and reprofiled financial assets, focusing on electronics. Looking ahead, it is worth noting that to finally put Samsung on its feet, in 1997, Lee Kuan-hee sold a part of Samsung Electronics shares to foreign investors for the first time in the company's history. The success of Samsung and the controversy with Apple Inc. Optimization quickly yielded results. Samsung companies returned to profitability and began to bring their own technological innovations to the market. In 1994, was developed the world's first 256 megabit DRAM chip, and in 1998, Samsung presents the world's first mass-produced digital television, which instantly becomes a hit worldwide. Lee Kuan-hee managed to adjust the efficient system of the holding company, the novelties, released by Samsung, later very quickly win the attention of the world community. The company's first smartphone based on Android, Samsung Galaxy i7500, was released in June 2009, and in 2010 Samsung managed to surpass Apple in smartphone sales. In 2011, Samsung became the world's largest supplier of smartphones. At the same time, a confrontation begins, referred to in the American media as the patent war, a legal battle between Apple and Samsung that stretches back for 7 long years. The dispute began while Steve Jobs was still alive. Apple, seeking to block Samsung in the market, accused the company of violating its patent rights to its own technology. In particular, the company was talking about multi-touch screen technology, as well as the design of smartphones. The claim, which exceeds $1 billion, was filed in 2011. The dispute was considered in 4 courts of different instances. As a result, only on May 24, 2018, the federal court in San Jose, California, was able to put an end to the case. According to Bloomberg, Apple Incorporated sued Samsung Electronics Company for $539 million. According to Korea Times, in 2012 Samsung's conglomerate revenue was $234 billion, which is almost 15% of South Korea's GDP, while its net profit exceeded $31 billion. The brand also comes in second place in the tablet PC market in the world. By that time Samsung Electronics products are sold in more than 120 countries. For the past 15 years, Lee Byung-chul has been at the top of the richest and most influential people in South Korea, and his name regularly appears in Forbes summaries. Recent history. Samsung Group has 17 listed companies and over 67 closed companies. The conglomerate is present in almost every possible field of activity, from the fashion and entertainment industries to shipbuilding. Like most Asian chaebol, despite all the efforts of the current authorities to eliminate them, Samsung still has a very confusing pattern of asset ownership. According to RG, the conglomerate is often called a state within a state or the Republic of Samsung in South Korea for its enormous influence on the country's economy and its closed nature. The founders' children and grandchildren own only a portion of the shares in each of the companies. According to analysts at Business Korea, as of the end of 2018, the total market capitalization of Samsung Group was $416 billion. Samsung's recent history is a history of successes and victories, heavily seasoned with the bitterness of numerous legal disputes, trials, and traditional Korean accusations of corruption. To begin with, Lee Byung-chul himself was suspended from his own company for several years in the 2000s because of a high-profile corruption scandal. On July 16, 2008, the Seoul Central District Court found him guilty of financial fraud and tax evasion. Lee Byung-chul was fined at $98 million and given a 3-year suspended prison sentence. A few months later, South Korean President Lee Myung-bak, head of the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2013, personally pardoned the businessman, and he returned to the management of the conglomerate. It is worth noting that such trials with members of chaebol families have been taking place regularly in South Korea since the end of the 20th century, exactly since the country's leadership set a course to combat clanism and reduce the influence of historically wealthy families on political processes. LG, Hyundai, and a number of other Korean conglomerates have also faced high-profile trials. Another interesting fact is Lee's internal conflict. In 2012, 25 years after the death of Samsung founder Lee Byung-chul, his eldest children, there were 8 of them, began to flood Lee Byung-chul with lawsuits, demanding to return the allegedly stolen part of their father's inheritance, the shares of Samsung Electronics and Samsung Life Insurance. Supposedly, Samsung Life is responsible for the lion's share of the conglomerate, for almost $4 billion. In 2013, Lee Byung-chul gradually began to retire from Samsung Group, handing over the reins to his only son Lee Jae-yong. After suffering a heart attack in 2014, Lee Byung-chul finally surrenders the business to his heir, but remains formally chairman of the conglomerate. In 2017, Lee Jae-yong's name began to appear in the high-profile corruption scandal that led to the impeachment of South Korean President Park Geun-hye. Ms. Park was indicted in the fall of 2016, when it was revealed that her close friend Choi Soon-sil had influenced the head of state's decisions, had access to classified information, and had served as a mediator in handing bribes from influential businessmen. One of them happened to be Samsung's heir, Lee Jae-yong. According to the prosecutor's version, Lee Jae-yong gave Choi Soon-sil $38 million through non-governmental foundations for patronage of his company, without unnecessary government attention to the impending transfer of the top position in the corporation by inheritance, writes The Guardian. In August 2017, the Seoul Central District Court convicted Lee Jae-yong of bribery and perjury, sentencing him to 5 years in prison. According to the BBC, on February 5, 2018, the Court of Appeals affirmed Lee Jae-yong's guilt, but reduced the original sentence from 5 to 2.5 years in prison, while deferring execution for 4 years as the Samsung Group heir went free and returned to the holding company. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.